Federal investigators are working to figure out who made a wave of bomb threats across the U.S. and parts of Canada. They believe it was an elaborate extortion hoax. The email threats demanded $20,000 payments in Bitcoin. Targets included government buildings, schools, businesses, and news organizations from San Francisco to New York. Jeff Pegues reports.
The reports of bomb threats spread like wildfire across the country.
This is bomb threat realness.
With mass evacuations from coast to coast. In Des Moines, Iowa, police scrambled to answer a flurry of calls.
In about 40 minutes, we had 4 businesses here in town get a hold of us and say that they'd received bomb threats.
In San Francisco, calls came in from close to 20 locations.
The types of businesses affected by these bomb threats range from offices, financial institutions.
As the calls came in, officers and
good job, buddy.
Bomb-sniffing dogs soon followed. But in every city and small town, the end result was the same.
We have not found any explosive devices or found any of the threats to be credible.
CBS News has learned that in recent weeks, federal law enforcement officials sent a bulletin to local police departments across the country warning of digital ransom threats after 15 states received similar messages between August and November of this year.
The very basic consequences to an attack or even a threat like this is that it costs business, it costs government, it costs taxpayers a lot of time and money.
CNET senior producer Dan Patterson says cyber criminals may be testing new methods to see how we respond.
Inevitably, at some point, we will have to contend with a cyber attack that harms or damages a city, may end up resulting in the loss of life.
And Jeff Pegues is joining us from Washington. So, Jeff, can you give us some perspective into the scale of the police response we saw yesterday across the country?
Yeah, it's really remarkable because these threats were spread out, not only here in the U.S., but also in Canada, and come to find out, New Zealand as well, the day before yesterday. And so this was some widespread effort to essentially terrify people into coughing up Bitcoin, close to $20,000. But again, investigators think that this is something that was not credible, yet you still have to respond to it.
So, you know, we heard Dan talk about just how expensive this is, but it's not just about the expense. It's about tying up police resources. And also, you know, in a situation like this, if you evacuate a building, then suddenly you have sort of people pouring out into open areas, and I presume they're vulnerable there as well.
Well, you're exactly right. This is the kind of thing, you know, even when you had an old-fashioned bomb threat, you would have police responding, and it ties up these resources. And this is the kind of thing that ultimately investigators will catch up with whoever is responsible. In fact, there were similar cases back in 2017. In those cases, they were emailed and called in threats to Jewish organizations. Investigators ended up catching up to the suspect who was in Israel, and just last month, the suspect was sentenced to 10 years behind bars. And so ultimately, investigators will catch up to the people responsible. But there have been these warnings in the past from law enforcement, as I reported in that piece, that they have been on the lookout for these kinds of threats because they've happened most recently between August and November. There are these common characteristics that they're looking for. And so even though investigators responded to this yesterday, they've been prepared for this kind of thing. And as you heard in that report, they find these reports or these emailed threats not to be credible.
And I know, I mean, it would be remiss of us to ask what police are doing to prepare for another instance of threats like this, but there really isn't anything they can do, right?
Well, there is very little they can do to stop them at this point, short of catching up to whoever is responsible. And in cases like these, you know, this is a computerized email threat that is disseminated, in this case, across the country. And these are anonymous, so it's very hard to track down who's responsible for it. In fact, there was one emailed threat to a middle school in Missouri. Investigators were able to track down that IP address to Moscow. But again, typically in these cases, the culprits are very good at covering their tracks and leading investigators down these dead ends. But ultimately, investigators will get there because they have cyber teams at the FBI working on something like this essentially around the clock.
Yeah, you remember when there were a number of Jewish centers in this country being threatened, and then it turns out, it was somebody in Israel. That's the thing about these threats, is they could be coming from absolutely anywhere. Jeff, thanks.